All right, guys, got a little bit of a lecture for you on listening. And we're going to talk about listening in this chapter and how it affects our communication, how it affects our actions, how it affects the ways that we perceive things, and how we can become better listeners to influence our interpersonal relationships and our role in the community, basically. Um, One of the biggest things that I want you to remember from this chapter is the distinction between hearing and listening. Um, Hearing, this is literally just the biological process of sound waves hitting your ear. Listening requires a lot more work. So, listening is an active process of receiving and understanding messages through words or by reading text. This is where we create meaning behind things. So, it's not just that, crap's flying into our head and we're hearing stuff. We're taking that, we're decoding that message, and we're ascribing meaning to it. We're actually coming to understand the purpose of the message, what the meaning of the message is, and then we can respond to it and construct meaning surrounding it. Hearing, this is when sound waves are received by the ear. This is when we just hear noise. So again, be very aware of this distinction between hearing and listening. Listening is an active process that requires us to break messages down and make meaning of them. Hearing is simply where sound waves are hitting the brain. So this is if you're watching TV and your mom's trying to tell you something, but you're in the middle of your show. You might and you're kind of ignoring her, and you're not really processing the messages she's saying. You're listening to the TV show and you're making meaning to what's going on in the show. You're only hearing your mom though. You're not actually actively listening to what she has to say. So, what are some problems with listening? We'll talk about a few of those really quickly. There's situational distractions. There's stuff in our environment all the time that's going to distract us. So, if you're having a conversation with somebody, again, if you want to use that example with your mother, you're watching TV, she's trying to talk to you, and the environment, what's distracting you right there is the TV show and the television that you're watching it through. These are situational environmental distractions. If you're in the cafeteria and you're trying to have a conversation with a friend, but there's all the background noise, there's something going on, a fight just broke out, somebody just chucked an apple and hit somebody else in the head. These are all environmental situational distractions. So the goal is to try to limit your exposure to those distractions and try to basically mind over matter and focus on the conversation at hand instead of focusing on the distractions. There's source distractions. This is when the person or the medium by which the message is being mediated exhibits a behavior that inhibits our ability to listen. So if somebody is you're talking to them and they constantly are picking their nose the entire time that they're talking to you, that person is the source. You're distracted by them picking their nose because it's freaking gross. That is going to distract you to listening to what they have to say. Or if they got a twitch with one of their eyes, you might be paying attention to that. If you are watching something, if you have a text message and they are, I don't know if there's some kind of weird background in the text message or something like that. These are all things when the source itself, where the message is coming from, there's something inherently distracting about that source itself. So the solution to this is to notice that distracting part of the message, move on from it, and focus on the actual message that you should be paying attention to. There's medium distractions. This is when the channel through which the message is delivered obstructs our ability to receive the message clearly. So this is if you are trying to communicate through a phone and the phone is static or you lose your signal or something like that, or if you are trying to send an email to somebody but it won't go through, you're trying to send a text but you have no service, so it keeps telling you that the text message hasn't been delivered. These are considered medium distractions. The tool that you're actually using to communicate from A to B is getting in the way. And also, what this also pertains to is if you're having a conversation with somebody and you can't get off your cell phone, you can't keep your eyes off your phone, you're worried about your Instagram or your Facebook or who's snapping you. So turn those things off when you need to actually listen to somebody that's talking with you. There's also this failure to focus on the message. There could be multiple messages, or your mind could be wandering. This could prevent you from focusing on what's actually being communicated. There's also a lot of biases that come into play. These are assumptions or attitudes about a person, issue, or topic that are made before we hear all the facts. We sometimes jump to conclusions too early, and that is what's considered a bias. When instead of listening to the entire message and really deciphering all the information, we kind of jump to certain conclusions early because we have assumptions or attitudes about either that person, issue, or the topic. Again, judging too soon. We think we're listening to a message and we fail to recognize that we are judging the topic of conversation or issue without hearing all the evidence or facts. This is similar to a bias, but this is where we don't really have a preconceived attitude towards it. But as we're hearing information, we're kind of like, oh, I know where you're going with this. This is what you mean, right? Instead of listening to the whole thing, we kind of jump in and make a judgment and a conclusion quicker than we should. There's also people with listening anxiety. I have listening anxiety. This is basically when you have trouble processing and interpret messages sent by other people. It takes work, but it can be overcome. I'm sure some of you have read an entire paragraph of a book, and when you get to the end of the paragraph, you're thinking to yourself, "What the hell did I just read? I don't remember any of the words." It's kind of like this with listening anxiety. This is when it's hard for us to focus on all of the information and interpret the messages because there's so much coming at us. It becomes a little bit overwhelming. And somebody with high listening anxiety has more problems with information processing and general listening effectiveness. If you have high listening anxiety, it's going to be harder for you to process information. It's going to be harder for you to process a lot of information. And overall, just your listening effectiveness is not going to be good. But this varies for all of us. Like I said, I struggle with this, but the more and more you practice, the more and more you try to focus on things, you can mitigate it, make it a little bit more manageable. There's different types of listening. There's discriminative listening. This is the ability to understand the different stimuli around us in order to process the meaning. We're able to focus on what's going on in our environment to think better. And there's critical listening. This is when we are evaluating an argument or we are developing an opinion based on evidence. We're taking all of the information and making a critical judgment on it, not just based on our emotions or opinions, but we're actually taking the information and trying to make an objective, basically evaluation of it. We have comprehensive listening, and this is when we're trying to understand and make meaning of the message. There's appreciative listening. This is when we're listening to other people because this is when we're trying to basically show somebody that we are listening because we want to listen to them. This is when we're listening to a comic or a stand-up presentation, something like that. And then there's empathetic listening. This is listening to another by responding non-judgmentally to their needs. This is if somebody needs emotional or physical support. This is where if somebody needs to vent, we're there for them. We're going to be empathetic and we're going to listen to them because we're trying to provide them some kind of support. Lastly, how can we become a better listener? Be very, very familiar with the Hurrier model. That's what this is called, the Hurrier model. Step one, this basically shows you the steps of listening. Step one is hearing. This is when, like we talked about, those sound waves are hitting the ear. We're turning hearing into listening at this point. We're processing things. Then understanding is the next step. This is where we start attaching meanings to those words. So the words come in, then we start to understand them. We remember them. We know the message for later interpretation. We kind of compartmentalize them. Then we interpret them. We make sense of the message. We try to understand the message in that context. We evaluate it. We think about the message to make some sort of assessment on it, and then we respond. Once we get to this point, we decide how we're going to respond and how we're going to react. Be familiar with the Hurrier model. Be able to identify which part of this process is which, if given some kind of example or something like that. Read this very thoroughly in your textbook so that you understand each part of the Hurrier model.